Hello, everybody. I'm Peter Frankopan, and I'd like to welcome you to this special event organized by Sotheby's in partnership with Intelligence Squared. Today, we're going to be talking about Reflection and Enlightenment, an exhibition of Chinese Buddhist gilt bronzes from the Jane and Leopold Swergold collection, and setting it within the wider context of Chinese Buddhist art. It's a real pleasure that you're joining us today, wherever you are, whether it's morning, evening, or afternoon, or if you're watching this in your own time. Of course, I'm very sorry that we can't join you in person as we're still locked down here in Oxford, but the online world that we've all become used to does have some benefits, not least that we can bring together experts from all over the world. Today we're in for a treat because we're going to be looking at some astonishingly important and beautiful works of Buddhist art, and to talk about themes ranging from the history of the Silk Roads to the spread of religions, from the creation of artworks to their meaning and interpretation, from the histories of individual pieces in the Jane and Leopold Swergold collection to the way in which the collection was assembled. I'm delighted to be joined by three of the world's great experts today. I know that you're going to enjoy listening to them. Each has prepared some slides, so you'll have a chance to see some of the pieces close up, and that's another advantage of lockdown and doing this event online. And there's also a magnificent catalogue which you can download from the link on the site. Today we have Annette Juliana joining us. She's Professor Emerita of Asian Art History at Rutgers University and Research Associate at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. Welcome, Annette.
Good morning.
We're also joined by Neil Zhang, the Assistant Curator at the UCCA Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing. Good evening, Neil.
Hi, everyone.
And then lastly, Julian King, Senior Director of Chinese Works of Art at Sotheby's in Hong Kong. Welcome, Julian.
Hi.
So first, we're going to start with Annette Juliano to talk about the origins of Buddhism and Chinese Buddhist art. So let's start with some context and some history. Annette, give us an outline of Buddhism and how and when it spread into China.
I'm going to first speak a little bit about Buddhism, as was just said by Peter. Thank you. Buddhism was the fourth largest religion in the world now. It has something like 520 million people, followers. It was founded by the wealthy Prince Siddhartha Gautama. He was very dissatisfied with his life, and he renounced materialism and tried to understand the nature of life, which was both suffering and unsatisfactory. So he launched on fasting and meditation until he achieved enlightenment. And one way to discuss Buddhism a bit is to show you the four sacred sites of Buddhism, as you see on the map. The first is Lumbini, which is on the border of Nepal, where he was born to his mother. He emerged from the side of her body under a tree. And then the second one is Bodhi Gaya, where he achieves enlightenment. And Sarnath is the place where he does his first lecture. And then finally Kushigara, which is where he did parinirvana and dies. So that these are these sacred sites which people make pilgrimages to from all over the world, and did in the ancient world as well. Buddhist monks from China made trips to these places to find sutras and texts about the religion. And the appeal of Buddhism was extensive in the sense that it did not have a caste system as the existing religion in India did in Hinduism, so that it appealed to all levels of society. And you did not have to be a rich Brahmin to achieve enlightenment, as Hinduism put forward. And also, you were not locked into your life by your birth rank. So this was and it was also very adaptable. It adapted to local conditions and local beliefs, so it made it more acceptable and easier for it to penetrate. And when the Buddha died, he said, please go out and spread the word. So it's a very proselytizing religion as well. So it moved out. Now, the actual spread of Buddhism and development of Buddhism will only spend 2 minutes or so to discuss a little bit about how it then moves into China. There are two dynasties in India, Mauryan Dynasty, which was the 4th to the 2nd century BCE, where the ruler Ashoka, a very famous man, became a supporter of Buddhism. He actually conquered all of China, of India. And this stage of Buddhism is, the question comes up is, how do you visualize the concepts of such a religion in art, as many religions have faced? And this first stage is symbolic or iconic, in which the actual Buddha as a human being was not represented, but symbols of his presence. So you had the pillars that Ashoka established, which showed the lotuses and lions. And then on the right side, you see them worshiping the tree. They worship his feet. They worship different symbols which refer to the Buddha. And these become the basis of iconography, which doesn't change no matter where the style of the art, the aesthetic may change in terms of how the drapery is represented or the face, but the iconography, the elements that identify the Buddha do not. And we see two more important things. The figure on the left is the stupa, which is a very key symbol in Buddhism. It's a funerary monument where the Buddha's ashes were originally formed, and then they became a symbol. It became a symbol of worshiping the Buddha by doing circumambulation around it. But as it travels eastward to China, you begin to see a change, and it becomes a tower, or what we call a pagoda in China now. And that continues on into Japan and Korea, the pagoda, which has become a kind of sign of Buddhism on the landscape of China. So then the next major change was the second big empire, the Kushans, who had an empire from the 2nd century BCE to the 4th century CE. And this is where the Buddhism has a major push out into the world across trade routes, and the iconic development of the Buddha at this point, where you see the Buddha manifested in human form, and the challenge of creating an icon which retains both its humanness, but also becomes symbolic of the ideas of Buddhism. And one of the things that developed in both is these certain symbols which become part of the iconographic vocabulary, the bump on the head, which is called the Ushinisha, which is the point at which your spirit leaves your body when you die. It also emphasized the capacity of the human brain expanded to see beyond tradition of life. And then you have the urna, which is the third eye between, which is again seeing beyond the illusions of life and the distractions of materialism and greed. And then you see the hands, the gestures. You have two gestures, one with the hand up, which is do not fear. This is called a mudra, where hand gestures which communicate to the viewer of the image. And the other is holding his finger, which is a teaching mudra, as well as several variants of other mudras, and there are quite a number of mudras. And on either side of the figure, you have the Buddha, you have Bodhisattvas, which developed with the development of a sect of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism, which is by far the most popular and dominates the Far East in China, Japan, and Korea. And you have other symbols like the tree that with leaves, which refers again to the Bodhi tree, which he sat under when he achieved enlightenment, and of course the lotus, which is a seminal image of symbol in Buddhism, which refers to the fact of this flower which grows, this wonderful flower grows in muck and mud, and then rises up with this beautiful, perfect petaled flower. So these are some of the symbols, and there are more, which though were integrated and become the iconography of Buddhism and do not change. This always remains the same regardless. You see two very different styles here, one emphasizing the body, smoothness of the body on the left, and the one on the right, which is from Gandhara in Pakistan, which has a strong classical qualities from the Roman Empire that influenced actually the development of the image of the Buddha. Now, the Bodhisattva is a very important element, and we will see an example from the Swergold collection, which is a very fine example of the Bodhisattva. The gilt bronze, small. This is Padmapani, or known as Avalokiteshvara, but in China becomes known as Guanyin, which is familiar to many of us. And as later on, after the 7th, 8th, 9th century, it becomes almost elevated to a goddess. But Bodhisattvas developed in the Mahayana Buddhism, which they were intermediaries between the Buddha, who was transcendent, and the human world. And they retained, they dressed differently. And you could see the Buddha on the left with his simple robe sitting on a lotus, and you see the Buddhist, the Padmapani holding a lotus, which is which is the symbol, and standing there with a dhoti, stars wrapped around a crown and jewelry, which refers to the retaining of their connection with the material world. But at this point, and differentiates them. But they became, these were intermediaries which helped people often pray to bodhisattvas to reach the transcendence of enlightenment. And this is a very fine example of early bodhisattvas, this gilt bronze and fineness of detail and the execution. And then what we have next is the Silk Road, because it was during the Kushan period that this it began to flourish on the Indian side, but it also flourished. It started in actually the Han Dynasty, the big empire in China, which collapses in the 3rd century AD. But you have these routes. We now call it the Silk Routes, but there were actually 3 silk routes. The overland route, which is the most famous and popular among people, that is the big one that goes from the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, all the way. And there's several, and through Xinjiang, around the desert, from Oasis to China. And this is how it reaches China. But there's also a maritime route which went around India through the South China Sea to the coast of China. And then there was a northern route, the Inner Mongolian route, which was, or Mongolian route, which is the steppes that went all the way across. It's called the fur route, actually, and has had the least attention. But the overland trade route is the most important in many ways of moving the religion. And it was, I like to connect them in terms of culture and commerce, just as the show I did on monks and merchants, because the monks were not involved necessarily in all the commerce, but they traveled with the merchants across from oasis to oasis, planting the seeds of Buddhism. And the Silk Road has actually attracted the imagination of the late 19th century adventurers and scholars like Oral Stein, who made these arduous trips across the deserts, stopping in oasis. And what you find are the remains still today, of unfortunately fewer of them, of these lost cities. And this is Jiaohe, which is outside of the city of Turfan, which has a huge remains of a large city with its stupa, and you can see the remains of a Buddha up towards in the top. And the stupa, again, it also can be square. It becomes a square shape as well. So this monument evolves, but symbolically it's the same, no matter what, in terms of holding a relic of the Buddha in its base and putting special objects in the base of the stupa and then covering it over, and all the symbolism and representations that are on the stupa. And then we get to, excuse me, how did, one of the questions that have always plagued scholars is how did the actual doctrine and imagery travel to China across these routes? And as I said, it's a gradual process in some ways and less gradual in other ways as it moves across the deserts. But you have small objects were a very important role. This is a small shrine on the left that's the size of a clamshell, which could easily be put into your pocket. And then there's the coins that Kanishka made under the Kushan, where you see the king on one side and the Buddha on the other, standing there. So these were some of the ways, as well as small Buddhist objects that clearly inspired copying by cultures as it moved across. As we can see from these examples from the Swergold collection as well, they have a very early example, which is a very fine example, very simple, and they're very tiny, so it's easy to tuck them into your pocket. The Buddhist monks may have carried them. They may have carried text with pictures of the Buddha, and these would have inspired the artists in the country. Here's another one. This is Padmapani again, the Bodhisattva, who again distinguished from the Buddha by the jewelry and the additional accoutrements, but again tiny. So that this was one of the ways that this ideas get transmitted, along with the monks who became adept translators, and actually the merchants did, particularly the Sogdians from Iran. They learned all kinds of languages and they controlled a lot of the trade. and set up, there were translation centers set up by the Chinese at various points to translate from Sanskrit into Chinese to communicate these ideas. And then, excuse me, these are two of the most famous early bronzes are known in China. This is one on the left from the San Francisco Museum from the Asian Art Museum 338. Things are missing from this, but you see the simple triangular Buddha, the triangular posture of the seated Buddha with his hands at his lap. It's supposed to look more like the one on the right, the hands in meditation posture. And the figure on the right, you see the point sticking up. This is flames, which also refer to the aura of light around the Buddha, and also the use of gold, which added to this idea of radiance in gilt bronzes and gold. So the use of gold was very appropriate in many ways to express this idea. And then you have the lions on the bottom, since his teachings were like the roar of a lion. But it shows the diversity of styles, especially coming into early Buddhism in China. They copied and adapted from different styles that were of images that were brought into China at the time. Now, the next, what we consider in terms of what I said next, why did Buddhism at this time? And that's the importance of the nomads. China collapsed, its empire collapsed in the 3rd century AD, and you had an influx of nomads from Inner Mongolia, now Outer Mongolia, and they estimate over 1 million nomads poured into China. But one in particular, one group, the Shenbei, were very interested in supporting Buddhism. They moved into North China and established the Northern Wei dynasty. And here they were incredible patrons of the arts, and they began to change patrons of Buddhism, I should say. They literally transformed the cliffs of China into these incredible cave temples, Yonggang being one of the earliest, which was made by a group of mixed various diverse peoples from the northwest of China all the way out to Dunhuang and on the Gansu Trail, and opened these in fantastic images. The second, this is another one they opened. They opened a number of them, the famous ones, Longmen, etc. This is Mai Jishan, which is called Haystack Mountain, which contains 2 images of wonderful monks. These are the earliest disciples of the Buddha, which had Ananda, the young merchant, the young monk, and Kasyapa, who was the oldest monk, and they were his first disciples. And hopefully you could see the one on the right, which is the Ananda, who is shown as a young, gentle man who was devoted to the Buddha, as well as Kasyapa, the old man in terms of the caricature of face. These are life-size, made of clay with armatures, which followed the way Buddhist sculptures were made in Xinjiang in Central Asia and further west. But there's a wonderful example in the Swergold collection, this gold image of the standing monk of Ananda, who captures this wonderful gentleness and centered sort of quietness and calm that was characteristic of Ananda. And it's very, very small, but the size really does, it doesn't really feel small when you see it in person. It actually feels quite monumental in its presence and its spirituality. Now, in terms of another wonderful example of the styles that were promoted and developed under the Northern Way, the very famous site of Lungmen on the right, which you see an example in cast bronze of this style that became dominant in the early 6th century, where the body became more attenuated and faded, sort of receded under this wonderful cascade of pointed drapery and a long neck with this head that was slightly tilted with a slight smile and a sense of this, again, internal centering, with the hand raised in the mudra on the right, which is do not fear, approach me, I have no weapons, and the other, which is charity with the hand open. But the kind of drapery that you see here was typical of what you saw in Lungmen, and you see in a number of pieces in the early 6th century. And this is an extraordinarily fine example, cast in bronze, that you see. There are a few, one in the Metropolitan and one in the Guimet, of this kind of style. And in the end, I'd like to, you have this last example, which moves away from the Northern Way, divides into four, the Western Way, Eastern Way, Northern Zhou, Northern Qi, in terms of internal fighting. But then China is finally reunited under the Sui and early Tang. And here you see a kind of synthesis in which you draw this very careful line, which this example on the left from the Swergold collection, in sense, captures. And you see an example, similar quality of the late 6th, early 7th in terms of Sui into Tang, where you have this line between the sense of retaining his humanness and naturalness at the same time of a certain amount of his symbolic presence. So he has an abstraction as well. And what it captures is this transcendent calm. When you stand near this figure and see it, or stand in front of it, you feel this sense, the exuding spirituality, calmness, and focus. And again, an exceptional example of small Buddhist bronzes, which are characteristic of the Swergold collection. Thank you.
Fantastic, Annette. That's a very rich overview, both visually, but also in terms of explaining the roots and causes and spread of Buddhism. It would be great to have a conversation to talk about some of the issues that you've brought up. One of the important ones, I think, is about how the standardization of Buddhist art works. How do these images look like each other? When you see a Buddhist image, whether you're in whatever part of China or South Asia, it's recognizably Buddhist. And it's very interesting to me how that works in the absence of a Brahmin class or of priests in the way in which the Christian church, for example, rabbis would do it. But the importance of texts would be great to get some discussion about that too. I mean, the thing about the Swergold collection, these 25 incredible pieces, is they tell a story about this transition that you just explained. You've taken us through a journey, but the pieces that have been collected both represent the periods and also the different regions. So it's going to be very interesting to hear how we try to understand these. So I'm going to bring in Neil Zhang now to talk about the visual representation and interpretation. And I think it's a good question to start with, Neil, to understand that these were all religious devotional objects. How should we look at these pieces as groups? How should we look at Buddhist art, and particularly the Swergold collection, as pieces that are works of art, but they also had a particular and specific purpose too?
Yes, definitely, Peter. So let's not forget those statues of Buddha. They're not only, well, so originally they're not really made for, like the visual enjoyment. And also we all know that before World War II, when the Westerns, our historian first visited Japan, they want to go to the temple to see the statue of Buddha, and the monastery, also monks, they refused the request. So that gives us the idea that those statues of Buddha, they're actually a sacred object. And with that being said, I think the mudra might be one of the way to look at those statues. And yeah, and so the word mudra is actually conveys the idea of power, as in the Pali, mudika, it means authority. It's in the same way that the royal seal symbolizes the authority and the power of the king. So the gesture symbolizes the divine authority and also the magic power of the deity. So those two mudras, they're pervasive. We can see them from Guandala, the early Indian, and to to today, basically. And those two mudras, they're both esoteric and exoteric. So they're not only associated with one school of Buddhism. So we can see them across the school and culture. So the mudra of fearlessness is, at first, it looks like a stop sign, like a stop. It's actually referring to one of the legend that Shakyamuni, he used this mudra to stop a drunk elephant by attacking him. So this mudra was able to protect Buddha against elephants, and it will also protect the believer against the assault of the evil. Yeah, so, and in the next picture, we can actually see another statue of Buddha with the same mudra. And this statue is been made in the 13th century. So after the last picture, in the last picture, the statue of Buddha we know it's actually from China, from the Song Dynasty. And in this picture, the statue of Buddha is made after the last piece. So we call it the Celio style. So the style after the Celio statue of Buddha. And so we can see, how this statue of Buddha is being transmitted and to being appreciated throughout the time. So in the next picture, we can actually see, one of the Swergold collection. And when at the first glance, it remind me of really famous statue from the Horyoji. It's a Horyo temple. It's the early statue, it's earliest wooden, structured temple in Japan. So if we see the next picture, everyone can see the similarity between those two statues. And so the Horyoji statue is actually dated later than the one from Swergold collection. So it made me think there might be a connection between those two, just like the pair we see before, the Celio styled statue and the one actually from Celio temple. So it made me think that, perhaps, so it could be a style. It's been really popular in Korean Peninsula or China and being adapted to in Japan. And so for the Horyoji statue of Buddha, we don't know exactly whether it's made in Japan or is made in China, and somehow someone brought it to Japan. So I think the Swergold collection can give us a clue about this issue. Like I just mentioned, so the mudra is very important for us to identify, which Buddha we're looking at right now. So besides, the mudra of fearlessness and the mudra of charity, there's another mudra. It's called the mudra of perfect knowledge. It's tightly associated with esoteric Buddhism, the tantric Buddhism. Like we'll see here, this mudra can only be seen on the Dynasty, the highest deity in esoteric Buddhism. So I give you this example so we can understand that the mudra is not only a simple sign to show you the meaning of it, it's also associated with specific deity.
Great. And the idea about mudra and knowledge and the connection, I mean, the as Annette said at the beginning, one of the attractions of Buddhism was it was offering a kind of a big cosmological view of how to live and how to behave. Tell us a little bit about, I know you've got this new show called Silent Thunder that's just opened at the UCCA. Tell us how ideas about how ideas about Buddhism, about Buddhist art are seen today in contemporary China, and how it's understood by artists and also by those who view these images. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So the exhibition Silent Thunder just opened at UCCA Beijing. This is I would say the few exhibition that focusing on this intersection between art, contemporary, and Buddhism. So because Buddhism is still very vividly, exists in China today, so it actually influenced lots of contemporary artists. And just like one of the artists featured in the show, Chu Bingchao, in his work, image making, so the artist, he uses the methodology of archaeological research. And his work is actually quite simple, as we can see here in the picture. Those are the casts of a Buddha he actually made. So Chu Bingchao is interested in this idea of, so how should I make a Buddha? What's who has the right to define the specific, style and the facial expression of a Buddha? So his work is based on the two very interesting archaeological texts and relics. So the first is in the 1987. There's a really big discovery in China. Is the relic of the Shakyamuni's finger. And so also Chu Bingchao, he utilized another instructional text, the Sutra of Measurements. So based on those two, he made his statue of Buddha with a factory in China. So he also, Chu Bingchao, he visits lots of factories today, because not like in the past, in the medieval China or Japan, the maker of statue, they're tightly associated with monastery, with monk, and some of them themselves is a monk. So like the famous Buddha maker, statue maker in Japan, Unke, himself is a monk. So today, Chu Bingchao, he discovered lots of Buddha is made in the factory. So that's also brings another interesting question. So in the past, there is a really deep understanding about the theory of Buddhism and how to make it, but that doesn't really exist now today. So does that really change, how we see and perceive, the work, the statue today?
Great. But, well, before I come to you, Julian, it'd be great, Annette, to ask you as a scholar of the ancient world, how do you see these contemporary images in relation to the Buddhist statues that we see in the Swergold collection or of Chinese and South Asian art? I mean, do these represent something similar and familiar? Is it a new departure? How do we interpret those from your perspective?
Well, I see them as both. They retain a certain connection to the ancient traditions in terms of iconography, the Ushanisha, the bump on the head, particularly the third eye, and also the mudras. At the same time, they seem to be exploring in other directions in terms of both sculpture and also their presence as icons. They seem to me to be somewhat different than the ancient traditions. They don't quite have the same. I mean, they have the same aloofness in some ways, but they also have a human quality that is stronger than the many of the icons as Buddhism becomes a more mature religion.
It's fascinating. Julian, how about you? How do you see that as someone who comes across pieces from the Swergold collection and elsewhere? How do you see the new interpretations of Buddhist art before perhaps you give us an idea behind how the collection itself was put together and tell us some about the pieces that you most like and that are on display?
I think, well, in terms of, devotees of Buddhism, they would see the images of the Buddhist deities as timeless. So yeah, it's really a question of how they see whether it's antique or contemporaries, somewhat irrelevant. They're just timeless images.
And what about this particular collection? I mean, it's very unusual to have such a substantial collection. I know that the Swergold said that they collected items that they like and that appealed to them, but in fact, it's built up into a extremely impressive and set of exquisite individual pieces. Tell us a bit about how the collection was formed and what has motivated the collectors to bring these pieces together.
So here's a photo of Jane and Leopold Swergold at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, where their collection was exhibited 4 years ago. You can see the wonderful Suede Dynasty Amitabha, which Annette discussed, right in the center. We're very pleased at Sotheby's to be hosting a non-commercial exhibition of their collection, which opens tomorrow. For those of you in New York and nearby in America, you'll be able to go. For everyone else, please do enjoy looking at the images online. To give a kind of brief overview of the history of the collecting of these early Buddhist sculptures. So they first started emerging in the early 20th century. With the exception of Japan, the majority found their way to the West, where their importance was always recognized immediately by American and European museum curators. From the 1960s, as the Japanese economy developed, the Japanese emerged as the dominant collectors. They recognized the importance of the development of Buddhism across the Silk Road into China and its pivotal role in the emergence of Buddhism and, specifically Zen Buddhism in Japan. By the 1980s, we saw the emergence of Taiwanese collectors who bought them not just as art lovers, but as practitioners of Buddhism and used them to adorn their family altars at home. In the last 20 years, of course, Chinese collectors have emerged as the strongest buyers of all Chinese art, and so much has already been bought back. It's therefore a surprise that what's arguably the greatest private collection of early Buddhist bronzes in the world, and certainly in the West, is with an American couple. They started collecting just under 20 years ago, but during that time have bought the very best of what's emerged in the market in New York, London, Hong Kong, and Tokyo. As they document in their scholarly book, Thoughts on Chinese Buddhist Gilt Bronzes, they originally started collecting early pottery tomb figures, but quickly became transfixed by the quality and spirituality of these intricate gilt bronzes. They were drawn to their serenity and to their highly complex movement and iconography, and specifically their small size, which enables an intimate connection. Before every acquisition, each sculpture in their collection was carefully researched, with the philosophy to look always for the best, to train their eyes to look long and hard at every object, to describe it in minute detail, and even to draw it. Every piece, like the Northern Qi, Suede Dynasty, Shakyamuni Bodhi we see here, every piece had to appeal directly to them, had to exhibit a level of spirituality, and for them to allow deep connection and intimacy through which the small scale of these wonderful gilt bronzes would speak to them. In collecting, they considered rarity, condition, completeness, iconography, and provenance. In the following examples from the exhibition, I'll show how each sculpture encapsulated this fivefold path to collecting. Also, how every piece has its own unique history, not just in the early dynasties in China when it was created, but also in the 20th century when each was appreciated and treasured by collectors all over the world. Because I deeply feel that this early articulation of Buddhist art in China is utterly timeless. As you see on this extremely rare figure of the historic Buddha Shakyamuni, which dates to the end of the 6th century, what immediately strikes me when I look at it is the beauty of the expression, so sensitively conveyed in meditation. He's also depicted in the Dhyana, the meditation mudra. It's very crisply cast, brilliantly gilded, with intricate depiction of the flowing robes of the Buddha. All aspects that are slightly reminiscent of the kind of flowing robes you see on Roman and Greco-Roman depictions of Apollo, an influence which goes through Gandhara and up the Silk Road to China. Unlike larger stone sculptures, what's so captivating about these small gilt bronze figures, this is just 14 centimeters or 5.5 inches, is how tangible they are. They were probably made for personal devotion, but in this case, they really can be picked up and lovingly handled. This beautiful figure of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara is extremely elegant, still very much Suede Dynasty, but has a hint of the transition to the more flowing Tang style. When I look at it, I'm struck by its poise, its elegance. In contrast to images of the Buddha, who has already attained enlightenment, Bodhisattvas have vowed to remain in the world of suffering on earth until all sentient beings have attained enlightenment. That's why they're depicted wearing such opulent jewelry, which demonstrates their worldliness. This is a superb example of the Sui dynasty preserved in very good condition. It's just 17 centimeters, again, a joy to handle. Like so many of the sculptures in the collection, it also has distinguished provenance. This is one of the key factors that the Swergolds considered when they formed their collection. This was actually originally in the collection of Feng Chao, who was an accomplished ceramicist, who later became a curator of Asian art in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. He was actually the one who laid out the Buddhist galleries. This image can be identified as Padma Pani by the lotus blossom at the left shoulder, Padma meaning lotus. In the Tang dynasty, we start seeing great cultural interchange between India and the Tang court, with monks traveling to India on pilgrimage or going there specifically to find Buddhist texts to take back and translate. On this magnificent figure, you can clearly see the style of the High Tang period with its sensitive treatment of the natural curves and flow of the body, so deeply influenced by Indian art, and characteristic details, including the rounded face, well-modeled cheeks, and opulent jewelry. This again, just 28 centimeters, 11 inches, but for this period, it's a large example. Again, if you go to the next slide, this also has very good provenance from the collection of Christian Human, a French aristocrat who moved to New York and formed arguably the greatest collection of Indian art ever formed. This is one of the very few Chinese sculptures he ever collected, no doubt because of the deep Indian influence you can see in the High Tang style. This is one of my favorite sculptures in the collection. Highly esoteric and extremely unusual in Chinese art, it depicts the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara in 11-headed form. The multi-headed form is derived from the Indian Tantric tradition, where deities have the ability to manifest themselves in multi-forms to help those in need. Here, the 11 heads enable the Bodhisattva to reach out and detect need in every direction. This also has a very interesting 20th century history. You can see it was formerly in the collection of Mauryan Motaheda. She was an adherent to the Baha'i faith and a prominent philanthropist who campaigned for religious tolerance. This rare Tang dynasty figure depicts the future Buddha Maitreya in seated position. Very elegant, typical Indian treatment to the robes. Interestingly, this was actually acquired from the son of Ananda Coomaraswamy. He was one of the first experts to introduce the scholarship of Indian art to the West, and he was the first keeper of Indian art in the Boston Museum of Fine Art. So you can see just how diverse and strong the provenance is of the pieces. Annette has already discussed these two, but I'd like to show them again, as they're two of my favorites in the collection, and they also show this distinguished level of provenance, which demonstrates also just how universal the appeal of all these figures has always been, that they've been venerated and treasured by the greatest collectors throughout the 20th century from a very broad range of cultures. This Eastern Way figure of Padma Pani was originally in the collection of Sakamoto Gore. Here you can see him in Graven House in 1962. He's famous not just for his unparalleled collection of Chinese art, but also for handling the Burni relief, arguably the most important Mesopotamian fragment of plaque from Old Babylon, 1800 BC, which is now in the British Museum. The next image the crowning glory of the Swergold collection, the Suede Dynasty Amitabha, was originally acquired over 104 years ago in 1916 by Adolphe Stoclet. Adolphe Stoclet was a Belgian collection financier who created the Palais Stoclet, the ultimate example of Art Nouveau, with interiors including mosaic friezes by Gustav Klimt. He assembled works of art from all cultures, paintings, old masters, impressionist, contemporary. This is one of the few early Buddhist gilt bronzes he had in his collection, and certainly one of the greatest have been in private hands. Before I hand back to you all, I do just want to show one more image, as it's so rare. It's not actually Buddhist, but it depicts one of the gods of Taoism, so intricate and so complete. It's richly gilded, with great distinguished provenance in the Zhang collection. It passed all the Swergold's strict criteria, which is why it's in their collection.
That's great, Julian. I mean, I think all these three presentations have made clear just how jaw-droppingly beautiful and exquisite these individual pieces are. So I really do hope anybody who's in the New York area is going to be able to go and take a look in real life in the coming week or so. I'll say some more about that at the very end. I'm curious, I'd like each of you in turn, and maybe I'll start with you, Julian, to talk about the issue of provenance and also restitutions and the kind of discussions that are going on in other parts of the art world right now. How do you address the question of statues created in devotional settings and religious settings no longer are there? How do we understand a traumatic 20th century that saw so much cultural destruction, changing ideas about Buddhism in particular in China, but also elsewhere? I wonder what you think about these kinds of issues, about what to make of pieces that are outside their settings. And maybe Julian, you have a go first.
I think there's probably two issues to think of. I mean, the first is we saw images early on of very large stone sculptures in their original context. I mean, some of these have historically been sold at auction and can be found in Western museum collections. That's something very different, where something site-specific has been plucked out of its context. A bit like the Elgin marbles, it's always going to be controversial. For these smaller gilt bronze figures, these are portable pieces. You know, these were made, we're not even entirely sure what the purpose was, what they were made for. From the very beginning, they may have been created with, you know, for someone to travel with. I mean, of course, the vast majorities start appearing on the market in the early 20th century, probably around the time you get a lot of railway construction in North China. I mean, Adolphe Stoclet's Suede Amitabha, that goes all the way back to 1916. I mean, what from a company point of view, I can say that what Sotheby's sells and what we exhibit, we conform to the strictest standards of American museums. And I mean, it's interesting, as I showed, actually two of the pieces in the collection are actually formerly owned by, you know, prominent American curators. I mean, people will always raise the question, I guess, when people come to the exhibition, they'll say, you know, why are these in New York with a new, you know, with a New York couple collection? Why aren't they in China? I mean, honestly, I can say that, you know, the Swergolds have been great custodians of this material. They formed a wonderful academic collection which spans the most important periods of Silk Road art. They have, you know, organized exhibitions at the museum in Houston, and we're now organizing other exhibitions. So really, the Swergolds have been custodians of this collection. They've enabled the greater public and scholars such as Annette to handle and study them. So I think it's all positive.
I think it's a very good and comprehensive answer. Annette, would you like to add something on this? How do you see things? You see pieces available and on display, and to see them being shared and admired and interpreted is what we scholars do.
Right. It's just that the gilt bronzes have presented a challenge to scholars for as long as I've been in the field, because first they assumed there weren't many of these bronzes left, because there are many texts who describe actually very large gilt bronzes that were melted down or destroyed over the centuries, just from, you know, revolution within China in the ancient world. But also, but then in the last, I guess, 20 or 30 years, as they have been rebuilding China, one thing that's turned up is lots of cache burials. Obviously, groups of objects that are not, they include gilt bronzes, but other things which were buried in haste. And there's been a lot of discussion as to why they were buried in haste. Were people stealing them and running? But usually during periods of chaos and political unrest. And there were periods of persecution of Buddhism in Chinese history where they just, an emperor would be a rabid Taoist, and he would destroy Buddhist temples. And some of these cache burials are found on the grounds of what were Buddhist temples many years ago, but now is an apartment building. So they present a challenge because, as Julian mentioned, they're portable, they moved, they were probably more a private votive experience rather than in these large temples, and they're not attached to a specific place. We have made progress in identifying centers like in Hebei of where they made some of these, and the quality of the casting of these in the Swergold collection speaks to the highest level of execution. There are a lot of other smaller bronzes you can see all over in museums in China. You can actually see them in the West as well that are obviously made quickly and were poorly cast and perhaps sold at sites as a, commemoration that I made a trip to this temple and took it with me, but that people don't even recognize anymore as being a Buddhist object or a votive object. So they present a challenge with this idea about, why should they be in the West? Because they were so portable, so mobile and movable, and they were movable all over China. In fact, some of them we don't even know where they came from originally within China.
And I suppose one of the questions, Annette, about what are these smaller objects is that we shouldn't forget that religions are always noisy. There's always a lot of competition for hearts, minds, and souls. And one of the reasons for the big monumental pieces is to be trumpeting that Buddhism is producing and offering solutions. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to make these large-scale objects as well. So we have a balance here, I think, of the smaller objects like in the Swergold collection that you've all spoken about, and the portable and personal faith with the wider political and religious messages that go with that too.
Big one. Yes.
Neil, tell us from a Chinese perspective. You're in based in Beijing most of the time. How does this question of provenance and of Chinese things outside China, how does it look? Do people in China feel that they should be acquiring these kinds of objects and bringing them home metaphorically? Is there an engagement with Buddhist art in a meaningful way in the ancient world, and trying to rethink how the arrival of Buddhism, what it meant to China back in the 3rd, 4th century BC?
Yes, definitely. So I would say, most of the people in China, they would like to have, those artifacts, those statue of Buddha, back to their original places. But, as you see, as like Anna just mentioned, lots of those places doesn't really exist today. And also as a, scholar trained in the States, I do think I agree with Julian at this point. I think those statue of Buddha, when they exist in the, academia, they can be, investigated. They can be, the scholar, they're able to tell, maybe the true story, or maybe how they should be able to seen by the others. So, and also just share with you one of the, story. At Columbia Star Library, we do have a statue of Buddha inside the library. And, when people pass by the statue, it does feels, there is a connection between, the students and the statue of Buddha. So I think, because you just mentioned the Buddha has been removed from its original context from, temple, but, I do think, for the believer, no matter where the statue of Buddha is located, when there is a belief, then it can be a temple, even without the structure of the building.
I think that's a great answer, and I think that's exactly what these pieces all represent. The fact that they're portable and mobile shows that your temple is wherever you might be. I mean, it would be great if we had a lot more time to talk about specific locations of the larger stupas, Annette, that you showed some at the very beginning, about the physical locations, about why there are efflorescences of Buddhism in some locations, what the meaning of caves is, and how one connects that to the environment and the important messages that come through engagement with the natural world that Buddhism also gives. But I'm conscious of time, so I'd like to thank everybody watching for giving up your time this afternoon or morning or evening to listen to this fantastic conversation from such wonderful and eloquent experts. I really hope you've enjoyed watching. If you'd like to come to the exhibition, Reflection and Enlightenment, Chinese Buddhist Gilt Bronzes from the Jane and Leopold Swergold collection, it's open at Sotheby's tomorrow in New York, March 11th until March the 17th. And I'd strongly recommend going to take a look at these magnificent pieces and this incredible collection if you have a chance. And of course, do remember to wear a mask unless you've had your vaccinations. Just before we go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to Annette Juliano, Neil Zhang, and Julian King for their contributions to today's event. And a big thank you to Sotheby's and to Intelligence Squared for making it all happen. Thank you very much. Thank you much. Goodbye.